Ron Deibert is professor of political science, and he's the founder and director of the Citizen Lab here at University of Toronto, and it probably needs no introduction to many of you. His research on cyber espionage, commercial spyware, internet censorship, and human rights is lauded around the globe. And he's the recipient of many awards, including Officer of the Order of Canada, and my favorite, Vice's One of the Top Humans in the World award.
Wow.
It's a backhanded.
I wish you were the top human.
Thank you. You too. Yeah.
As governments and corporations around the globe are using technology to censor, hack, surveil, and pollute the internet, he and his small team, though they lack the data of hundreds of thousands of computers that large cybersecurity and antivirus companies have access to, are a model for how to rethink the questions of freedom in the digital age. In addition to his many books, reports, journal articles, and co-edited volumes, I highly recommend Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society, which was delivered as part of the 2020 Massey lecture series, and also his conversation with the Nobel Prize recipient Maria Ressa, where they discuss ways to defend democracy against the proliferation of online disinformation. And you can find that on the show On Ideas on CBC, that you can find Ron and Race's discussion there. Okay,
Thanks
great.
so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Teresa, for inviting me here, and for all of you for coming. So just a few background remarks about the Citizen Lab for those of you who don't know. We do research on digital security issues that arise out of human rights concerns, so we don't cover this big terrain of cybersecurity. Instead, we focus in on issues like cyber espionage, surveillance. We've done a lot of work over 20 plus years documenting internet censorship worldwide, so that sort of thing. The lab is truly interdisciplinary. My background is international security. I'm a political scientist by training. However, most of the people who work at the lab come from many different disciplines, and we especially leverage computer science, engineering science techniques, but also law, area studies. We have people who are experts in various regions around the world. And we have a lot of partnerships with many groups, especially NGOs that are local to countries that we're interested in around specific projects. We collaborate extensively with groups like Access Now and Amnesty International these days. We've gotten very good at forensic science, I would say, especially around documenting the trade in mercenary spyware. Normally I would give a talk mostly on the methods and findings of the research around the Citizen Lab's investigations into mercenary spyware, but I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to talk to you about a few different things that I'm concerned about. But the mission of the lab is to do digital accountability research is the way I kind of think about it these days. I think we're part of a field, I would say, of groups that are doing work with that mission in mind. When I actually wrote the proposal for the Citizen Lab back in the year 2000, I think it was 2001, 2000, I described wanting to create a center that would do evidence-based research in the public interest, and I described it as a counterintelligence for civil society. And at that time, there was a lot of hubris, you know, it was like, oh, come on, you're not gonna actually do that. And now, 24 years later, that's kind of precisely what we do. There's an old adage I bring to mind whenever I think about that: careful what you wish for, because there's, you uncover a few things and then you become a bit of a target yourself. So I want to talk today just kind of some loose thoughts really around AI and the intersection of the market for something actually, Lucy, you mentioned in the last section in the context mostly about mercenary, traditional mercenaries. I think about mercenaries in a slightly different context around the market for products and services that are provided to government clients in the area of intelligence and national security practices, which is a broad umbrella. If you think about all of the activities that governments have traditionally done in the area of covert operations or clandestine operations, including espionage, subversion, disinformation, propaganda, all the way to targeted assassinations. All of that now is marketable. There's a huge private sector that is orbiting around all of that. And AI is featuring very prominently in just about every aspect of this. So I just kind of want to run through, mostly show you some marketing brochures that I'm interested in and where my head's at. And there's a particular aspect of this area that I'm very concerned about these days and trying to figure out a way for the Citizen Lab to focus on. So just by way of a reminder to kind of set the table, to talk about the business model of the personal data surveillance economy or surveillance capitalism. I think it's important to start there and remind everyone that no matter how social media, big tech platforms advertise what they're doing, they're principally about one thing, and that is gathering as much information as they can from us, their users. We're the livestock for their data farms, in other words. And so I love this image. I don't even know where I got it or where it comes from, but to me this encapsulates the business model of the personal data surveillance economy. And applications are particularly important aspect of this, but the fact of the matter is we leave digital trails wherever we go, and there are all sorts of unique identifiers that can be attached to us as people, to the equipment that we use, to the networks that we connect to, all the way from the infrastructure through to the hardware, the operating systems, and of course the applications. And because there is this pressure to collect so much data from users and market it and commercialize it in some manner, application developers can be, of course, very aggressive. This is just one of, you could substitute many examples of this sort of thing. This is a study that was done a few years ago that showed that a class of applications were circumventing permission restrictions routinely to try to get access to sensitive data like locations and other settings and so on. So this is pretty routine, right? And we see that sort of thing all the time. They're kind of relentlessly trying to gather as much information in spite of whatever privacy regulations or restrictions may be put in place. And I would say also there's an inexorable logic to the personal data surveillance economy. So, one sensor leads to another sensor, to more sensors. And the whole idea, of course, is to, this insatiable appetite to find out more and more about users leads ultimately to more highly invasive forms of data gathering. So, of course, now it's very routine to have, biometric profiling, looking at retina or the dilution of your pupils or whatever. And where this leads ultimately, of course, is to internet networked neural monitoring. And of course, there are companies now that do this, and I hesitate to even bring it up, but let's say it. Neuralink is owned by Elon Musk, the person who took and purchased Twitter, which was already a dumpster fire, and turned it into a misogynistic, hate-filled, toxic mess. So when you think about, well, that's the person who owns this company, what could possibly go wrong, right? And, there are companies like this one, Affectiva, which are employing AI to combine all of this to give more insight into people's, not just their behavior and their consumption practices, but to their interior states of mind as revealed by whatever features they are able to gather from their applications or whatever sensors they have. And I would say all of this is accelerated because of the pandemic as well, right? If you think about the ways in which we're now reliant on all of this technology, remote exam proctoring technology is one good example of how this stuff has become very normalized. And this is a graphic from a guy named Wolfie Christie. He runs something called Crack Labs. If you're interested in this topic, I find his research is very insightful. And again, this is just a reminder. I think everybody in this room is aware of the kind of, the mechanics of the personal data surveillance economy. So we have all of these IDs, both traditional identifiers as well as new types of identifiers that come from social media, and other identifiers that are layered on top of all of that can be collected and used to develop profiles on people. And of course, there's a system that's involved here. I think he does a good job of kind of describing this, where you have all of your interactions, whatever you do, they feed into the system, which then can constrain the opportunities you have as a person. Like, you know, what do you want to do in life? What are you going to see? What type of advertisements are going to be pushed in your direction? This stuff used to be kind of, you know, fantasized a bit, I would say. Like, people would warn about it, and they were, oh, is it really true? Is that, you know? Actually now, if you look at, this is a company's advertisement. What they're doing here is saying the quiet part out loud, right? They're advertising the fact that, oh yes, in fact, we are listening to you. And we want to find out, you know, what you're talking about with your spouse when you're painting the bedroom. You know, the AC is running low and blah, 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 right? So they're saying the quiet part out loud. All of this is to say that there is all of this, you know, layering of sensors, and really I think a lot of the root problems that at least I address have to revolve back to the underlying business model of surveillance capitalism. And I think we can't fix a lot of the other problems until we get at this business model. Now, they're not that company that I just showed, they're not the only ones who are saying the quiet part out loud. This is a now defunct Israeli surveillance vendor called Ability. They would actually market a cell phone interception service to government clients. And they certainly get the award for the creepiest slogan. While others talk, we listen. No thanks. By the way, I said they're defunct, but it is often the case in this industry. We have found that what happens is a company gets a bit of notoriety, usually bad notoriety, and maybe some economic challenges, and they'll fold and rebrand, and the principals will go somewhere else, and so it becomes quite difficult to track them all. I said I'm interested in one particular aspect of AI, or at least something that's kind of AI related, which is a new area of intelligence gathering, relatively new anyway, called ADINT, advertising intelligence, which is, you know, ADINT, you have SIGINT, Andrew will be familiar with that, others maybe in the room, I don't know, signals intelligence, human intelligence, HUMINT, TechInt. Well, now there's ADINT, and basically this is the market that is comprised of firms that are participating in real-time data broker exchanges. And instead of selling that data, which they're bidding on, to other advertisers or other firms, they're selling it specifically to government clients, and especially to national security agencies, so intelligence and law enforcement. I've got a few examples here. This is Aspectum. They're twinned with a company called Prodicio. And you can see that this is their marketing brochures. They are bragging about their ability to compile foot traffic data. So they're actually gathering this location data from the applications on people's devices. They're going to real-time bidding exchanges, and they're getting that information. So this stuff is really quite precise and granular up to a point. So you can go on these bidding exchanges, and you can draw a geofence around this room in this building and say, I want to know about the type of people that are here. And that could allow you to make inferences about maybe even the individuals and their identity of the people who are in this room. Now, what's especially concerning here when you look at the marketing brochures is some of the scenarios, the use cases they talk about. So you can see here disaster mapping, forest wildfires mapping. Hey, what's wrong with that? Nothing, but social unrest monitoring. Geez, I wonder what type of government would be interested in that. And they actually have a little profile here about how they did an experiment and mapped Black Lives Matters protests across the United States. So I think there are some obvious questions to ask about that particular firm. Here's another one. That's an Israeli company called Patterns. You can see here they're very much in this ADINT space. Virtually any app, close to 1 million apps monitored and tracked. They talk about having something like 5 billion unique user IDs profiled. You know, if that's true. By the way, a lot of these advertisements you have to take with a grain of salt. Some of it could be snake oil, and usually is, but ultimately that doesn't matter because it shows you the aspirations of the marketplace. And sometimes the snake oil is worse than something that does it as advertised because of the risks of unintended consequences and things like that. But if they are doing what they claim to do, over 5 billion unique IDs, that's almost every person on the planet. And then you look at some of their brochures. This, by the way, this is leaked material that was put in the public domain. Here's an example of what they can provide to a government security agency. So full user profile, applications used, people nearby, recent locations, device details, work location, home address, gender. This is an intelligence dossier. So one way to look at this is, oh, this is very useful if I'm a law enforcement, I work in law enforcement, I want to solve a crime. Yeah, but it's also obviously very useful for extortion, for blackmail, for kidnapping, for targeted assassinations. All of the things that other government clients routinely do as well. Interestingly, Patterns also advertises something that caught my eye because of the Citizen Lab's work on targeted espionage, and that is that they claim to be able to combine the advertising intelligence, the ADANT, with offensive capabilities, in particular targeting spyware, malicious software, and injecting it onto a target's device. This is something that we're very concerned about at the Citizen Lab because we have certainly seen this type of data being used for pre-targeting reconnaissance. So if I want to inject mercenary spyware on your device, that's a pretty expensive asset that I'm potentially wasting. If I fire it at your device and I don't know exactly where you are, what jurisdiction in which you're located, whether the malware will actually work. Are you using an operating system that my spyware is able to exploit? All of those things you want to be able to kind of triage beforehand. And that's where this integration comes in very handy. So you'll want to go to some of these, maybe the ADINT marketplace, find out about certain classes of targets, or maybe about where individuals are located. Maybe you don't want to hack somebody's phone if they're based in the United States, because that might bring about the scrutiny of US regulators. So you wait until they travel to a third country that has less of a concern from that perspective. Here's another company. This is a company that's founded by India-based entrepreneur. It's called Shogi. I think they've moved now to Singapore, latest I remember anyway. And a lot of these firms are doing this now where they're talking about a whole kind of suite of surveillance tools that include ADINT, what I was describing, but also more offensive capabilities. And this is where the AI comes in as well, right? Because you're combining very large data sets to try to triangulate information about specific targets and their movements right down to the browser that they're using on their device in order for you to be able to precisely pinpoint what type of malware you want to inject or target at them. Backing up for a bit, I just want to highlight a couple of reports that the Citizen Lab published around the topic of AI and national security in the context of Canada. So the first report is Bots at the Gate. This was published in 2018, and it looked at the use of what we called at the time algorithmic technologies in the context of evaluating immigration and refugee claims in Canada. And a second one, a couple years later, was a comprehensive study across the country looking at police forces, local police agencies, as well as the RCMP, for their use of algorithmic technologies, which is basically, machine learning, AI technologies, we call them in this context. Both of these were qualitative research projects, so they involved extensive interviews with serving and former law enforcement or customs and border personnel, as well as pretty detailed access to information, freedom of information requests. And the picture that came up here now, 5 to 7 years ago, was that these agencies are increasingly using these technologies, They're getting them from the private sector. They're not transparent about how they're using them. And this is going to create serious human rights, civil liberties, public accountability problems. Because we have, generally speaking, although it's gotten better, I would say still, it's fair to say we have pretty weak oversight in this country when it comes to some of the law enforcement intelligence agencies. And the problems persist. So just, about a month ago, Privacy Commissioner came out and said, hey, the RCMP is still using this product called Babel, from a company called Babel Street. And it sounds innocuous, this stuff. It's like, we're doing open source information gathering. What could be wrong with that? Isn't that what everyone does when they surf the web? We just, why shouldn't our police officers be able to also use Google, right? That's kind of the narrative that comes in the other direction. But what they're actually doing, as the Privacy Commissioner is warning us about here, is they're not just using Google. They're going to companies like this, which have these, AI-powered, insights platform that, gobble up all of this data that's out there, including data that's not even apparent to the targets as they go about their day-to-day life. When you think back to some of those graphics I showed you about all of the IDs that are embedded in the devices you use and the networks that you rely on, there are firms that specialize in basically synthesizing all of this and presenting a portal to their clients, which goes far beyond what sounds like something so simple as open source information gathering. We're also seeing a lot of stories coming out, investigative journalists in the US talking about various security agencies in that country relying on some of the marketplaces that I've been describing, especially the data broker or the advertising intelligence space. So ICE, using some of these data brokers to gather location data, various other apps as well, even military intelligence using that type of data. And the big problem, of course, is when it comes to law enforcement, they're gathering this highly personalized data, very revealing, very intimate data without a warrant, right? So in a liberal democratic society, typically that's the sort of thing you'd want to go to a judge for and get permission. And here it's just, free, Wild West, basically, unregulated space. Same thing at border checkpoints. Senator Wyden and his staff have been pretty vigilant about this sort of thing. So if you're interested in what's going on in the United States, take a look at what's coming out of his office. Recently, they discovered that it's routine for data to be collected from travelers as they pass through customs. This goes, enters into these large databases, which then are subject to this sort of analysis and interrogation. Of course, AI features very prominently there as well. Speaking of Senator Wyden's office, recently they also discovered that one of these firms had been called Near Intelligence, had been contracted by an anti-abortion group, and they used the cell phone data that I've been describing here to actually target advertisement at individuals who were visiting Planned Parenthood facilities, right? So that gives you a sense of the sensitivity of the type of data that could be extracted from the advertising space. Now to step back a bit and talk about this sector as a whole. So, broader than just advertising intelligence, I'm talking about the whole surveillance industry, having spent now 20-something years deeply immersed in it and doing a lot of research in this space. Companies are highly unethical. They're very opaque. Frankly, many of them flat out lie about what they're doing. They've enjoyed a degree of immunity, I would say, because of the type of clients they have and the markets that they operate in. So they have clients that are secretive, that lack accountability and transparency themselves. Government security agencies typically operate in the shadows, especially the ones that are authoritarian regimes. We think about it in the context of Canada or the United States, that's one thing. But if you think about some of these other countries that are being serviced by these firms, really is nothing like oversight to speak of. There are no checks and balances in place. So the technology is almost certainly going to be widely abused. And a lot of them use this rhetoric that you see here from the CEO, former CEO, I should say, Shalav Julio of NSO Group, which is adversary of the Citizen Lab, I would say, because we've exposed a lot of this company's, the abuse of this company's technology. They typically say something like, well, you know, our technology is essential to help governments investigate serious matters of crime or terrorism. Problem is that what constitutes a criminal or a terrorist is in the eye of the beholder. It's a very fluid term. So I could spend like 6 hours going through the last 15 years of evidence-based reports of the Citizen Lab and our colleagues showing this to be the case with respect to the mercenary spyware industry. It's pretty grim. I mean, we have seen and uncovered case after case of astonishing abuses. So governments using this very highly invasive surveillance technology to get inside targets' device, legitimized under this rubric of fighting crime and terrorism, but ultimately going after journalists, human rights defenders. I think of in Mexico, the international investigators into the 43 student mass disappearances. We found those phones were hacked. Of course, all of the family and colleagues around Jamal Khashoggi, we forensically verified their devices were hacked with Pegasus. We don't know what happened with his particular devices because they were given to his fiancée before he went into the consulate, and then she presumably gave them into Turkish intelligence. But I assume they were hacked as well because literally every single person around him, including a Canadian permanent resident, by the way, Omar Abdulaziz, we were able to verify those phones were infiltrated with Pegasus spyware or other types of spyware like it. So contrary to what Shalav Julio says, I would say, actually you should be very, very afraid of what's going on in this sector. If you did a kind of ethnography of the industries that I'm talking about, as I said before, they're opaque, they employ deceptive practices. In fact, many of them employ many of the same corporate obfuscation techniques as the oligarchs and despots that they serve, you know, and the same ones that are used by money launderers. So they will set up businesses and jurisdictions that allow them to evade whatever meager regulations might be in place from, say, the Israeli Ministry of Defense. And there are some export controls in Israel, believe it or not, around this sector. But some of them are too stringent for these companies. So what do? They set up shop in a place like Cyprus so they can then turn around and sell this type of technology that I'm describing to militia, genocidal militia in Sudan, or to like Bangladesh security services that are involved in horrible acts of violence in that country. So there really is no oversight. There is no, despite what the companies say, there is no check or constraint about to whom they sell this stuff to. It is really a disaster. I'll give you a few examples that kind of punctuate this point based on Citizen Lab's research in this area. So this report was done actually quite a few years ago, I think in 2017. One of the spyware firms that we were interested in, another Israeli company called Cyberbit, they actually made a mistake in their infrastructure. One of the things that we do at the lab is we use a variety of network scanning techniques to try to keep track of the command and control infrastructure of these companies. And this particular firm, they made a mistake. They left a directory wide open on the internet. In this case, we could actually, surf this and see what was in this directory. And within the directory was actually a very meticulously organized inventory of all of the hacked devices that were hacked by their product, by their spyware, including a demonstration laptop that Cyberbit employees would take with them to show off their spyware to prospective government clients. So that device, whenever it was opened and used in demonstrations, it would check into this directory. So we actually watched for 8 months and just let this thing kind of unfold before our eyes, and we couldn't believe what we were seeing as the Cyberbit employees traveled the world. And here you can see in this little breakout box a great example. When you have that type of information and then you correlate it with other information that's out there, we could actually see that, oh, okay, they arrive at a certain night at the Radisson Hotel in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. And, you know, like any good staff member, salesperson, it's 11:29 at night. What are you going to do before bed? You're nervous. Well, I'm going to check my presentation, make sure it works well. Next morning, they get up, 8:30, same thing, have their coffee and breakfast. And then where do they go? Oh, to the National Security Service at Tashkent. Uzbekistan, by the way, boils dissidents to death. Okay, so that's the type of client that we're talking about. And you look at some of the others, Office of the President. There was a demonstration at the Office of the President of the Philippines, who at that time, not a very pleasant person. Here's another example of how we capitalized on an error that one of these firms made. This is a company called Circles, which is at one time a sister company to NSO Group. They don't sell spyware. What they sell is a surveillance service that's connected to faulty signaling messages on telecommunications networks, which is known as SS7. So this is an old protocol. Not too many people are aware of it, but whenever you land in a foreign country and you open up your phone, it'll say, you know, welcome to Germany, you're roaming. Well, behind the scenes, there's a whole set of protocols involved that authenticate subscribers. You know, oh, this is Ron from Rogers in Canada. He's now on Deutsche Telekom. Who's going to handle the billing? All of this stuff. Well, companies like Circles figured out if they could get a license as a telco operator, they would get inside this club and have access to these signaling protocols. So we were interested in them, and we discovered, I won't say how, but long story, that they had a certain firewall, checkpoint firewall, on their installations that they would set up at their government clients' facilities, and it was misconfigured. So we could scan the entire internet looking for instances of these checkpoint firewalls. To cut a long story short, these are the government clients at the time of Circles. And again, here you can see it's a pretty worrying picture. A lot of these government clients are notorious abusers of human rights or involved in acts of transnational repression. And that type of capability, by the way, it allows you to track the location of any device anywhere in the world. Also intercept SMS messages. So think about two-factor authentication coming from text messages. Circles provides government clients with the ability to intercept two-factor authentication coming from SMS messages, and in some cases actually intercept the calls. So this is a major vulnerability in the heart of the telecommunications infrastructure that very few people, maybe other than Andrew and a few others, know about. After our report was published, there's actually a person who used to work in this industry named Gary Miller, and he worked for a mobile security vendor. He was so troubled by what he was seeing on a day-to-day basis, he became a whistleblower, and then I hired him full-time at the Citizen Lab. And he's a wealth of information about this, including something that we published about where he was able to observe malicious targeting requests coming out of Saudi Arabia on the order of like several million over a 4-month period of Saudi people roaming in the United States. So Saudi Arabia is using this type of service that I'm describing to track the movements of Saudi people as they're traveling across the continental United States. Again, this is the type of thing that AI, as we move, this is a snap, you're looking at the rear view mirror of the technology in a sense, because this is a few years old, so you project forward, thinking about the use of machine learning or artificial intelligence around this sort of targeting. It can get very precise and it can scale up in ways that are truly astonishing. I want to pivot just quickly to China for a few minutes. I think it's important to talk about China in the context of the conversation we're having here. It's obviously a very big economy. It's a one-party state. It is very involved in the development of AI. Of course, as you listen to the discourse in the United States, is very much about the race between the United States, Europe, and China, and also a very ambitious information control regime, cyber espionage capabilities, surveillance, and influence operations. And we've been doing research on China since the very first days of the Citizen Lab. So I think it's important to take stock of what's going on in that country. And I'll just point out a couple of Citizen Lab investigations. So with respect to WeChat, we have a team that has studied extensively censorship and surveillance on WeChat. And we found way back in 2016 that they were using algorithms to censor not just text on conversations over WeChat, but actually to identify images. And we found through experiments that our team did that even novel images, once they were sent, were analyzed and put into an inventory of future censorship measures to be taken. And then we found in 2020 something that was really quite shocking. So WeChat, if you are registered with a Chinese number, you're subject to censorship on the platform. So if you type in certain text messages or put in place images, they simply won't appear on the recipient's side. But if you have an international registered number, like a Canadian number, and you're using WeChat, as far as we could tell, there was no censorship. However, there was an experiment done by Jeffrey Knockle in my lab where he was able to show, and again, I won't get into the details here, read the report, but WeChat was actually using the communications of international subscribers to refine their censorship algorithms for domestic users. Really quite remarkable that that was going on, but also a good example of how AI is being used to refine domestic repression. If you're talking about China and information controls and AI, I think you have to talk about the so-called social credit system, which for a while was getting a lot of hype. The reality is, as far as I understand it, talking to people who are experts in the country, it's unevenly applied is the best way to put it. So there are some jurisdictions in China where it's more robust, others where it's not really operating at all. But I think the picture that is being presented by this is really, frankly, quite Orwellian. So, we're used to credit rating systems here in Canada and the West and so on. You have all these traditional inputs, but the mission, the objective here is to combine things like, your credit card bill payments with social inputs, things like, volunteer activity, academic honesty, payment for public transportation. So maybe if you get on a subway and you don't pay, that'll affect your social credit score. And online inputs as well, things you do online. And ultimately, this will affect more than your ability to purchase products. It will affect the whole opportunities for you as a person and as a citizen to do things like maybe get a visa to travel to a foreign country and so on. Like I said, it's unevenly implemented, but it's pretty scary to think about this. The thing that I want to highlight about it is the extent to which this is very much private sector driven. Not just Chinese companies, but foreign companies as well. So this is a leaked PowerPoint presentation that The Intercept got a hold of a company, American company Oracle. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. What they're doing here is they're basically pitching AI-enabled technology to Chinese police to integrate all the data sources, to give them the type of thing that's quite common in the US, data fusion centers, for example. Of course, the big problem here is you're dealing with all of this in the context of something like the social credit system and an authoritarian regime. Bad enough in the United States, but here, of course, much worse. I think China has the most CCTV cameras per capita in the world. A lot of them are now AI enabled with all sorts of facial recognition technologies and other features that we've been talking about. There's a nice study done by Article 19 looking in particular about the use of emotion recognition technologies of the sort that I talked about at the beginning of my presentation, how a number of firms are involved in that part of the surveillance net. And when I looked at this report, I was looking at some of the names of the companies. And one of them stood out for me, Neurologics. I thought, what's that company? oh, it turns out that they're based right here on University Avenue. So, and they're one of these companies that's providing services to China's domestic repression apparatus. Making this picture even more disturbing are the findings of two recent Citizen Lab reports that were authored by a Citizen Lab fellow named Emil Dirks, who did open source information gathering, really quite ingenious as well. Take a look at these reports if you want, where he discovered that there is a wholesale mass DNA collection going on in both Tibet and other regions of China. This is blood samples being taken of Tibetan populations, millions of people, and iris scan collections as well. So you can see where this is all headed. And of course, China exports a lot of the technology, and the private sector, Chinese companies, benefit by the backing of the Chinese state. There are soft loan arrangements for other governments around the world that have, usually under the rubric of smart city development projects, especially in Africa and the Middle East. So a lot of this technology that's being refined in China is ending up being exported abroad, which is a very familiar story in this area. Have to talk about influence operations. So like many countries, China has a pretty ambitious propaganda, disinformation, psychological operations, influence operations, all of that stuff. All the major powers are in this game now, but we're seeing more and more evidence that China is really experimenting with AI-enabled disinformation, the use of deep fakes, audio, synthetic audio is becoming quite common. Actually, Microsoft put out a report just a couple of days ago that's a really good survey of what China is doing in this area. I highly recommend it. You could see that they talk about a couple of case studies involving Chinese influence operations that had deepfake videos and audios that were especially targeting elections in Taiwan, but also in Canada. And this is aligning with what some of the Canadian security agencies are talking about, and there's a foreign interference inquiry going on. So all of this is very much real, something to be concerned about. There was a breach of a Chinese contractor, and think of this as like the NSO group of China. Always wondered, are there Chinese companies involved in this space? And then there was a breach of this company's data called iSoon. So there is a private market around this stuff in China, and eventually that private market will find its way outside of the country to other parts of the world, and it'll be even more difficult to regulate those companies. What I said about China and influence operations is not restricted just to China, of course. I think we're entering into a particularly dangerous phase around the combination of AI, deepfakes, and influence operations. The way I see this is a bit different than some of the narratives that I see anyway in the media about this topic. Some of them are very good, but I think it needs to be situated in a kind of historical trajectory here. What we're talking about really, what this represents, is the privatization of subversion. And this is truly unprecedented in human history. The CIA, FSB, whatever, they all have been doing this for decades, right? But they rarely outsource. And when they did, it was usually as a front company for some operation they tightly control. As you were mentioning earlier with respect to mercenaries, now we have privatization of covert activities, psychological operations, and I worry increasingly like the targeted assassination technology that you described in the context of Gaza. I wouldn't be surprised seeing that involved in targeted killings by repressive regimes once they get their hands on that sort of technology. This is a company called Psy Group, now defunct, rebranded as a company called White Knight, based in the Philippines. Interesting choice. This is an Israeli company now based in the Philippines. I believe that a company like this being based in the Philippines is no accident, because actually a lot of disinformation for hire is run out of Manila, which is historically because of call centers and fluency in the English language in the Philippines. So there's kind of infrastructure set up for this sort of thing. Anyway, Psy Group was at one point, had a connection to this guy, George Nader, who's a convicted pedophile who Trump pardoned, just to give you a sense of the quality of personalities involved in these type of companies. But I love this one because they're again, saying the part of reality is a matter of perception. I don't think they're reading, I don't know, Virilio when they're coming up with that. They're being literal, right? And then Guardian did a nice expose of this team Jorge. This is one of many companies now that we're seeing that are actually advertising helping clients win elections. I don't believe that, again, here, there's a lot of snake oil going on here, but there's no doubt that this advertising is going on. There are companies that are providing services, maybe not good services, but they're providing it. And the services may be flawed now. They're going to get a lot better, difficult to track. This is a good example of Team Jorge's Archimedes system that they were relying on. Archimedes is a previous Israeli surveillance vendor that also went under. But you can see the description of the product that they're talking about here. It looks a lot like actually what the RCMP were using with Babel Street, except that this is oriented towards manipulation and influence operations around elections. Just to conclude here, I'll say a couple things. This is the thesis of my talk, and maybe I should have put this at the beginning instead of the end, but here we are. This is what I kind of see going on here. I see this superpower securitization happening, amplification of all the abuses and harms that we've been documenting over the last 20 years, suddenly now taking off. And yet operating in an environment that is still governed by safeguards that come from the 19th century, early 20th century. And most countries are doing very poorly at this, or have mixed success. But the vast majority of countries have very little on the bottom of the graph to speak of, and it's the vertical gap between the two where the prospect of the abuse of power lies. And I really worry about that part. Finally, I'll just say something about the risks of doing this type of research for an organization like mine, where we are doing this counterintelligence for civil society. We're actually gathering primary data. We're not just commenting on things. We're actually, in some cases, as you can see from at least a couple of the presentations, disrupting ongoing state cyber espionage as it's happening. So when we publish, we're breaking up their party, if you will. And that's a bit dangerous, to say the least. So there's several risks that I've experienced in the course of doing this research that I think is important to talk about in an academic context like this. First of all, I've been threatened and with suits, sued many times. It's now so customary that I have a large staff of legal experts in the Citizen Lab, and the University of Toronto's Chief Legal Counsel office has appointed to us outside counsel, and we also pay for several, depending on the case, law firms to assist us in tricky things that we're involved in. That all costs a lot of money. And fortunately, the University of Toronto is very supportive of the Citizen Lab, but change of personnel could change that. So I'm aware that this is a big risk, strategic litigation. There are companies and government clients that want to silence the work that we do. This would be the most effective way, in my mind. This is not the only way. We've been subjected ourselves to a lot of disinformation, some of it kind of amateur. This one was a bit surprising. I woke up one day and found out that Polish state television ran this weird graphic on primetime television where I'm in like this mob diagram. I guess I'm part of like a pawn of Russian intelligence. None of this is true, of course, but this sort of thing actually does have an impact on your credibility, because what happens is, even though it's ridiculous, well, this is crazy, I can refute this very easily, it doesn't matter, because just the hint of some impropriety or something that you've done wrong, it sticks, and people start to question your credibility, and that may be the ultimate intent. And then lastly, we have been targeted directly by private intelligence firms ourselves of the very sort that I've been describing. Just before the pandemic, we discovered that a firm called Black Cube, which is made up of ex-Mossad agents, tried to infiltrate the lab, surreptitiously record my lab staff to get audio recordings that could be used to discredit us. Fortunately, we figured out what was going on as it was happening, and we organized our own counter sting in a Manhattan restaurant. And you could just Google that. You could see the whole video where we turn the tables on this person who will no longer ever be working as a private investigator from this point on. So just some concluding thoughts. I would say that right now, when it comes to AI, privatization of intelligence and national security, we are in an experimental phase. So there's a lot of stuff that looks kind of cheap and amateur and maybe not very effective. A lot of the AI-enabled influence operations don't really stick. They're not gaining a lot of traction. But I think there's no doubt about it that governments and corporate clients are really developing this stuff right now. There's a really aggressive push. And I think we're on the cusp of widespread adoption. And the thing to worry about here is really the use of what I've been describing by repressive regimes, because we already have a big problem with transnational repression. A lot of these governments are reaching across borders to silence dissidents and activists who have fled abroad. Some of them actually use very sophisticated targeted killing, targeted assassination campaigns. All of this is going to get more precise and I believe much more concerning, amplifying all the harms and abuses that we've seen based on the way things have unfolded up until now. I just see more of the worst. And overall, I would say in the sector that I've been describing here, there's a real problem with transparency and public accountability on both the parts of the corporations that are supplying these services to the governments and to the government clients themselves, which tend to operate historically in the shadow. So I wish I had a more pleasant set of remarks to give you for the end of this event, but that's it for me. Thank you.